Hello. Wonderful to be here.
Wonderful to be here. You had a hard
fantastic.
time getting here
I
yesterday?
did. There was some lunatic on the train station in London yesterday protesting Brexit. Some mad Englishman who wanted to get England out of Europe, which is happening. And the train station was closed. So can you hear me okay? Yeah. The train station was closed and the place was packed with people. And there were no trains. There was no train to Amsterdam. So I stood in the line and got my phone out and booked a flight instead, and got here last night.
Yeah. And I asked you, how did you spend today? You said, I went to a library.
That's what I did. I had some hours to kill yesterday.
Yeah.
And the British Library is right next door to St Pancras Station.
Okay.
So I had about 3 hours to kill. So I went to do some work.
And you just sat there writing, or you just went looking?
No, I was transcribing some thoughts that I had been dictating into my little recorder the night before.
What kind of thoughts?
Thoughts about the books I'm writing, and about this, and about a show I plan to do on Abbey Road later this year. So just various thoughts about life and work.
I was wondering, you have been, as we sit here, we all have been thinking a lot about the Beatles, but you probably the most of all of us. I mean, yeah, well, for a very long time already. Do you still have new thoughts about what happened in those magical years in the 60s?
Yes, all the time.
How is that possible?
Because I spend my entire working days, which are quite long, researching the Beatles or any aspect of the history, the greater history. And the more you find, the more you have new things to consider. So there's a lot to consider.
And there are still new details popping up every day.
Constantly.
When you do your research.
Not only new details, but new photographs, new pieces of paper, documents with information, new recordings perhaps, new bits of film or video, new something every day, literally every day, every single day. And much of my day is spent processing what comes in, because everything needs to be titled and filed properly, otherwise it's of no particular use. You don't know where to find things. So
yeah.
A lot of my time is spent on that element of the job.
Yeah.
Just making sure that I know what it is I have.
Yeah. And what kind of, what can you share any of the new insights you had like last month?
Oh, there's so many. You'd need to be in the bath with me. That's where most of them come.
The bath?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're willing to do that.
Yeah, have to be quite a big bath. I work long days, and then, depending on what else might be happening in my evening, I will go and have a bath and maybe put on some music. But as soon as I have a thought, I stop the music and record my thoughts, and then they have to be typed up the next day, because they're no use on the recorder. They need to be in a piece of paper where I can look at them and deal with them. Things, approaches that I need to make to people, questions I need to ask people. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this event, about the bed-in 1969, because of this, because of coming here, and because of the event at the Concertgebouw on Wednesday. I want to make sure that I know what it is I'm talking about. So I've re-immersed myself in 1969 and John and Yoko and the bed-in, which isn't really where my main focus is in my book writing at the moment.
No, because you're writing part two of
a trilogy, which will be 1963 to 66. And so 1969 is beyond that, but I couldn't come here without reminding myself of what it is I need to say.
Yeah.
And to look at it anew. And because of the anniversary, there are so many photographs that are surfacing that I haven't seen before. Many in the exhibition in the lobby of the hotel. There's a film made of the honeymoon, so-called it's called John and Yoko, Mr. and Mrs. Lennon's Honeymoon, which has been circulating for many years, made by, pronouncing Peter Goossens. Is that right? Peter Goossens. It turns out that because of all of this activity, a man who has a second tin of film which hasn't ever been seen has now found his film, and I'm hoping to see it this week. I believe it might be a little bit of it on the NewsHour program tonight. So anniversaries bring things to the surface.
Yeah.
People come out and say what they have and what they remember. And it's useful for me because there's always an anniversary with the Beatles, right? It's useful for me to grab whatever comes in, and then in about 10 years' time, when I'm really writing about this, I have it all from this week.
Yeah.
You know, I've got all my thoughts, all my recordings, the photographs, the video.
But I'm afraid your work never will be finished.
I'll be finished.
You'll
one
be
day.
finished.
And that will be the end of me.
Yeah.
And
the end of your work, but not before that moment.
No.
And of course, I brought my very old copy of the recording sessions.
Yes.
Our Bible, as we sit here.
Really?
Yeah. Well, mine it is.
Okay.
Is it? But I think that it's dated now. I mean, it's.
Yes. That book is
old.
It's 30 years old now.
Yeah.
And it's quite out of date and quite poor for the modern day, I would say. I wouldn't recommend anybody to read it.
No?
No. I wouldn't. I don't.
Why not?
I wouldn't.
Why not?
Because of the circumstances of its writing, because I was quite a young man when I did it, still in my 20s, quite new to writing, quite immature, and not as capable of expressing myself as I am now. And because so much more...
it's poorly written?
It's okay.
It's okay.
People like the way it's written, but I can't read it.
You can't read it?
Yeah, I can't read it.
And information-wise?
Information-wise, so much more is now known. There's so much more knowledge now available about what they did and what it sounded like and what instruments they were using and what the circumstances were. And there's no context in the book of their lives. It's just about every time they came to the studio, which is fine, but I'm now much more interested in telling the whole life.
Yeah.
And having the composition of songs and the creation and the writing, the recording of them as part of what an artist does.
Yeah.
Whereas that book is just about the studio.
Yeah.
So
That makes it interesting.
I am rewriting all of that now within the trilogy that I'm writing.
Yeah.
It will all, in essence, be written again.
Yeah.
And I'll write much more about the creative process and about every session.
Yeah. And last January, you watched all the raw footage of the Get Back sessions. Day by day?
No, it's almost right. What I actually did was listen to all the audio.
You listened to the audio?
Yeah, which is 97 and a half hours of audio of the Beatles in January 1969. They filmed and recorded themselves, and it was meant to be used for something, and it ended up being an hour and a half of it in the Let It Be film, and the Let It Be album was issued, but all those tapes leaked out somehow about 20 years ago. Somebody leaked them, and they began to circulate amongst collectors, and they sat on a shelf in my office. And I thought, oh, God.
You didn't listen to them before?
Not straight away. I had bits of them.
Yeah.
I had an index of them, and I went into specific things that I needed to hear. But the whole thing, no, I hadn't done that, but I have now.
And you thought it's 50 years ago. You made like a moment for yourself to listen to them day by day, exactly in the order of how it happened.
On the 50th anniversary of each day in 1969, I did it this year.
And what did you hear?
I heard constant surprises. I heard 4 creative musicians at work in a time when they were always, according to the history as received, they were very unhappy and arguing all the time and frustrated, and George quit, and it was just miserable.
Yeah.
And what I heard was not that. What I heard was something quite different. What I heard opened my eyes and my ears and my mind to where it needed to be, which is the truth and not the myth.
The myth is that those were notorious sessions.
The myth is
in
that
a very bad mood.
Yes, and they perpetuated that myth. They were the cause of it, principally. John Lennon's interview with Rolling Stone in 1970, he called them the most miserable sessions on earth. George Harrison also said they were utterly miserable, and it was just the low of all time, as I think he called it. And you don't hear that. You just don't hear it. I mean, George does walk out at one point But all the circumstances that were in force before he walked out are still in force when he comes back. Nothing really has changed. And then he's in a very, very upbeat mood. And most of the time, they're in a very good mood. There aren't any arguments. Any. And George Martin said they were arguing constantly. And the tapes have no arguments. So there's a big gulf there.
And why did you think they saw it that way? I mean, I don't think George Martin lied about those sessions on purpose. So maybe it's like his feeling. It was his feeling.
I think when they broke up, and then the film came out, and the film was edited in quite a bit of a downbeat, dark way. There are many upbeat, happy moments in the Let It Be film, actually. But the overall impression of the film is that it's a bit depressing. And because it was issued just after it was announced that they had broken up, the whole Let It Be project had this kind of black cloud over it. And you see in the film the one little debate that Paul and George have the whole month, in which George is saying, you know, I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. That's my George Harrison impression.
Very nice.
Because of that, you get the impression that that's just the tip of the iceberg. But in fact, that's about the only bit of clash. And that was
the iceberg.
Yeah, that is the iceberg. And now that I've listened to the whole thing and transcribed it, I was transcribing it in January as well. So I have exactly what it was they were saying. In the film, that's being edited from quite a few minutes. It didn't really happen quite like that. There were bits in between where they weren't talking and then they carried on. And in the film, obviously, it's been brought together in the editing suite.
Yeah.
And history got slightly changed by that.
Yeah.
And by that film. And they ended up remembering the sessions as miserable. But honestly, this is not about... I'm not interested in changing history. Far from it. I just want to know what happened.
Yeah.
And because they filmed and recorded themselves, there is an opportunity to see and hear, mostly at the moment here, but when the Peter Jackson film comes out, we will see more. And I think people will be in for a surprise. It really wasn't quite like that at all.
Yeah.
So it changed my head completely.
Yeah. Was that a good feeling for you, or did you also felt a little bit ashamed that you thought the wrong way for such a long time?
No, you can only go. You have to. You can only, if you read every book or you read primary sources. That's what's really important. What John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo said. And also Brian and Neil and Mal and maybe George Martin and so on. Those people who were really there, those are the views that really count. And you have to accept what they tell you. But fortunately, there are tapes, you know, and you know, for whatever reason, they painted those sessions a particular color, dark, and in reality, it's much brighter.
Yeah. I was asking this because, of course, when John Lennon and Yoko Ono came here in the Hilton Hotel, the band was actually maybe in a better state than we always thought it was in retrospect.
Yeah, on the first day of the bed-in, when John opened the door and the press came in and there was a press conference on the first day, and he inevitably was asked about the Beatles, and he said, this is like a week off, he said, for the Beatles, because they were very active and they were hardworking, so they really did have kind of like a diary, and they could see that for one reason or another there was a week. And John said, okay, then that's when the bed-in happened that week. And he said, we're going back to England to finish off an album. So the Beatles were still together. They had not broken up, and there was no sign yet of them breaking up. Although in January...
the spirit wasn't that bad.
The spirit wasn't bad, and in the fascinating thing in January 1969, in these tapes that I was listening to, quite a few mentions of them breaking up. And they talk about it quite evenly, without emotion, without difficulty, quite openly. There's no secret. They kind of know that it's possible. But in what way do they
talk about it?
It comes up in conversation, you know, that they might break up. It just comes up in kind of in conversation. Yeah, Paul McCartney has an idea in January for that project. the thing about January '69 is they just didn't have a united goal of how that month would finish, and it ended up on the roof, but it wasn't how they thought it would end. And at one point, Paul says, we could be playing in like a newsroom, and there could be loads of journalists around, and there could be a story from Vietnam, and a story from, Amsterdam, and a story from London, and a story from New York, and the student riots in Paris, and all of that, and then the Beatles break up, he says. And that's January '69, and he says it just like that. And then they talk about it and carry on playing a track.
Yeah.
So
so the spirit wasn't that bad, and the idea of breaking up,
it didn't frighten them. That's what you can take from that. It didn't frighten them, and they were open to the possibility of it, but still prepared to carry on as long as it felt right.
Yeah.
And it felt right through much of 1969 until about September.
Yeah. And would the idea of being the White Album sessions be in such a bad spirit? Is that also like exhilarated?
Yes, it has been. But again, they were partly responsible for it.
Also.
Because after the Beatles broke up, they were always being asked to explain why they're broken up. And they started to look for
They had to make a story out of it.
Yeah, I'm not saying they created something to deceive people, but it was just, we all remember our own lives differently.
And we all want to make a story of things that happen.
Yeah, and the White Album was always meant to be an unhappy record for them to make, and Ringo did walk out during the course of it, and the presence of Yoko did destabilize things for a while, though I think they got the stability back quite quickly, much more than people think. But if you talk to two of the men who were in the studio, a lot of the time, Chris Thomas and Ken Scott, they both say that they remember it being happy. And Giles Martin last year, for the box set that came out, reviewed all the tapes and heard only constructive, creative work. And let's face it, you can't record music that brilliant, that wonderful, if you're not together as four musicians. You just can't do it.
No.
It would show in the music if there's disharmony. But in fact, they were so tremendously creative together that quite clearly they were able, whatever differences were emerging, it didn't affect them in the studio.
No. And Jeff Emerick walking out was like because he was so bored, or?
Yeah. Jeff Emerick, the Beatles recording engineer, quit quite early in the sessions because he was unhappy with the atmosphere. He said it was because they were being short and snappy with George Martin. And he didn't want to be around while they were doing that. It was all a bit of a strange one, really. I didn't quite understand it. I mean, they'd been short and snappy with George Martin from very early on. It wasn't just beginning, because that's who they could be. But nonetheless, it was still constructive and creative. It was just, blunt.
Yeah, exactly. But what I was asking, the state of the band was probably better than we always thought when they arrived here.
That is a key point.
That's a key point.
Because we know that they broke up in '69, and because this is one of many solo so-called endeavors in the year, it looks like this is the path to the breakup, but it's not.
No,
it's not. They do an album.
What did the other Beatles think of John and Yoko doing the things they did here?
They didn't know about the bed-in until they read it in the papers, like everybody else, because they weren't literally together that week. It was decided quite late. Interestingly, in March 1969, and for the whole of the rest of the year, John Lennon talked about peace. It was the number one primary passion in his life was peace. And in the month of January, where there's a recording of him speaking all the time, he doesn't mention peace at all. I mean, I transcribed the month and I just did a word search on peace and it doesn't come up.
So how did this idea of world peace come into his head?
So it came in February, obviously.
As it usually does.
Yes, yes, exactly. The bed-in event is the combination of two events, isn't it? It's hairpiece was a concept and bedpiece was a concept. Hairpiece is grow your hair for peace. And bedpiece is go to bed and talk about peace or do something peaceful For us, it's bed, but for you, it might be something else. The whole thing about the bed-in was really to energize people to take some kind of action in their lives. It need not be going to bed. It could be something else, but do something. This is us. This is what we're doing.
Yeah.
And that's why behind John and Yoko's heads in the window of the Hilton, it said hairpiece, bedpiece, because it's the fusion of those two ideas makes the bed-in. That plus that equals this. And that's why they put them up there, so that we could see what the origin was.
Yeah. And do you think it was Yoko's idea or John's idea?
It was Yoko's idea to do an event, because she did happenings. That was
her way of...
Yes, yeah. She was a performance artist and did things that stoked people up, that made them think. Although they didn't necessarily think what she was hoping they would think, they usually just thought, how stupid is that? But nonetheless, she wanted to make people think. And John, the great communicator, or probably no better communicator in all of rock music or most of the 20th century. No. Extraordinary man.
Yeah. You see that in the films made in the bedroom or in the hotel room, how approachable he is, and how incredibly well he communicates with everyone that's appearing at the bedside.
A real human being.
It's incredible.
Able to communicate with all people at all levels in a good way, if he wanted to. He did. Yeah. I mean, some people found him abrasive, and he could be, of course. Some people found him rude, which he could be. But when he was switched on and had a purpose in mind, he really knew how to engage with people. He talked in a mature way to people of all ages. He didn't talk down to anybody. He was probably the least prejudiced man on the planet that year, I would reckon, and probably for most of his life, John Lennon. It didn't matter who you were, what color you were, what race you were, what religion you were, or anything. No. He would talk to you and treat you with respect and dignity. Yeah. And the whole of the week in Amsterdam, he was doing that, and then did it again in Montreal. It must have been a
burden for him too, to communicate with everyone that way.
I think he got into it, and I think he got energy from it. I mean, towards the end of the week, he was saying how exhausting it was, which it was. I mean, because you're in a bed, somehow it looks relaxing, but it's just, you could just as easily be sitting on a chair or standing up or whatever. Yeah. Because if you're engaged with the people in the room, if you're talking to them for hours, if you're sincerely putting across a message repeatedly to different people, and yet always in some original way, every journalist went away with something a little bit different from the next person, then that is exhausting.
Yeah, some very hostile, some very friendly.
Well, they invited hostility into the room and dealt with it knowingly, which is an extraordinary thing to do.
Yeah, but they had to deal with it.
There was a lot of hostility because it was such a weird thing to do. I mean, we're here because we understand, or we like John Lennon, or whatever it might be. We believe it's worth celebrating the anniversary, and it surely is. But at the time, if you go back and consider how people considered it in 1969, well, I can speak about my home country in England. John Lennon was considered mad, rude, unpleasant, bonkers, just a crank. He takes his clothes off and poses with his girlfriend. He splits from his wife. He's busted for drugs. He's got hair down to wherever, longer hair than anybody wanted people to have. Yeah. And he was, for a substantial proportion of people in the population, mad. And this event confirmed it for them. And then the next one, Bagism, which was born in this hotel.
The Bagism was born in this hotel?
Yeah. That confirms it even more. They're just mad, completely mad. I realised I didn't answer your question about what the other Beatles thought.
No, but...
What the other Beatles thought was always, it's John.
Well, yeah.
That's all.
It's John.
It's John, and they completely loved John.
Yeah. They adored
each
John.
One of them adored John Lennon because he was the founder, the originator, the leader.
You pointed this out very well in the first part of your trilogy. It was John, Paul, George, Ringo. That was the order, and that was the order of things. It
was the order of John started the group. Yeah. He brought in Paul. Paul brought in George with John's okay, and George brought in Ringo with John and Paul's okay. But that order is the chain, and it became
in which it always functioned.
Well, it was a psychological chain for them. It wasn't just a name for newspapers or posters of whatever. It was a chain of just the way that they dealt with one another. It was just they all respected one another. But Ringo had his closest relationship with George, although he was also very close to John, and a little less close to Paul. George had his best relationship with Ringo and John. Paul had his best relationship with John.
Yeah.
So you can kind of look at it up like that. And that was explained to me. That isn't a theory. That was explained to me as the truth by the Beatles' perennial right-hand man, Neil Aspinall. He explained it to me several times because he always forgot he'd told me before, and he would tell me again, which I always enjoyed hearing again. So that was fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the others about the bed-in, they just thought, it's John.
It's
I
John.
mean, they respected everything John did. They would
even bring in Yoko.
The biggest one was Two Virgins, because they had learned by 1968 that any one of them doing anything rebounds on all of them. And the big one for that was the year before 67, when Paul McCartney admitted taking LSD. He kind of outed all of them as LSD takers, and the other three didn't want that. Mm-hmm. They'd been taking it quietly and weren't going to mention it. And suddenly it's out there, and because Paul said it, it was kind of inferred or reckoned, understood that they all took it. So when John came in with the photos of him and Yoko posing in the nude, and said, I'm going to make this an album cover, there was quite a lot of consternation that night. That was August 1968. And Ringo says it in the anthology. Ringo said, oh, John, if you do this, it looks like we've all done it, kind of thing, in a sense, in their head.
Yeah, we're a group.
And John just said to Ringo, well, Ringo, you've only got to answer the phone, meaning if a journalist phones up, you just need to tell him that it isn't. It's no big deal, really. And Ringo he had the presence of mind to go, yeah, okay. Ecology so well.
Yeah.
And so once they had posed nude, anything was possible. Of course, at the bed, people thought actually that they were being sex in public. Because the next step, I mean,
Posed nude?
we've already seen what their bits look like.
Yeah.
So they've just got married, they're on honeymoon, and the press came to the bedroom. So actually people thought they're going to be having and we can all watch.
Yeah.
And that was why a lot of press came over from Britain, because they were hoping to be there. And were disappointed to find them sitting up in bed in nice pajamas, and Yoko's got a nice nightdress on, and it's all quite, the decorous. And
he was just playing with his toes all the time.
Yeah, playing with his toes, because he was double jointed, John, so he could get his leg up in strange places.
Okay.
And kind of get his leg up here.
Yeah.
And talking peace.
Yeah.
But as I said earlier, most people in Britain just reported the bed. And they're talking peace. And there was a man, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a man by the name of Donald Zeck. He was a very well-known journalist, a columnist in England on the newspaper called the Daily Mirror. If you've seen the footage of... yes, it is in the documentary, that's right. Is that the one we're going to see today? Okay. When they did the second bed in Montreal, there was a man called Al Capp who came along and stirred things up a bit and got John a little bit cross because he poked him just where it hurt. And Zeck was the Amsterdam version of that. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, John invited him in, knowing what kind of acidic piece he was going to poke fun at it. And in the end, John spent about, I don't know, maybe an hour with him. It's all on film. And just giving him a message. And Zeck is saying stupid things that people did think, like, how is your staying in bed going to stop the Vietnam War? And of course, staying in bed is not going to stop the war. But bed is just the forum for the message. And the message is give peace a chance. And Give Peace a Chance was born in Amsterdam as well. Even though it was recorded in Montreal, it came up here.
The song was written here.
No, but those four words came together here. Give peace a chance, as a message, was born in Amsterdam.
Okay.
During the week at the Hilton, And then in Montreal at the second bed-in, he recorded it and had some words by then. But
the 4 words,
the
give
message,
me the chance, popped up here like in this room.
Yeah, he says it in the Zek interview. He says, "Why can't you just give peace a chance?" or something like that. And then they go straight on from Amsterdam to Vienna, and in Vienna he actually says it, "Give peace a chance." So clearly it's come up in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
It's the takeaway, what we would now call the takeaway thought.
Yeah.
From the 6 days in bed here.
Yeah.
7 days inclusive was give peace a chance.
Yeah.
And that's all he was saying. Yes, me being here won't stop the war. And Zek, for some reason, John thought it would happen that way. And how are you going to stop the war? And John was trying to tell him, but people had closed minds, and they were mostly speaking to people with closed minds. And I think one of the reasons they came to Amsterdam was because the ears of people are a little bit more open here. In the film, in the Goossens film, you see Dutch journalists interviewing John, and they are receptive to the idea of non-conformist behavior. In England, they would not have been. No. In England, they would just poke fun at it. So he came here because he was heard better here.
And you think his message was sincere, or his thoughts on peace were?
Yes. Yes, completely sincere. Absolutely. There's no doubt. There's not even 99% sincerity. It's 100. It's 100. And Yoko as well. But John did most of the speaking because he was more articulate.
He's a communicator.
He was more articulate.
And isn't it strange that at the beginning of the year he never talked about peace, and then suddenly it was all peace?
John Lennon's whole life was marked by sudden, deep enthusiasms for things. If he got into something, he would go deep fast. And once this idea came up, he knew what to say. The thing is, John Lennon was a great reader, and when Paul McCartney, at the age of 15, went to John Lennon's house for the first time when John was 17, there was I think it's like the 10-volume. It's either, I've got it in my notes, but it's something like the 6-volume Churchill's History of the Second World War, and the 10-volume history of something else about mankind. John had read them.
Really?
He had read them, and at the age of 17, he had read those books. He read newspapers all the time.
Yeah.
In the Goossens film, you see the mail arrives. John opens the mail, and it's letters attacking him. And he will read them, and he might read them aloud, and he'll say to Yoko, "Look at what somebody's saying," or he'll tell the camera what he's. He wanted to know what people thought.
Yeah.
And the newspaper comes, and both he and Yoko sitting quietly on the bed, turning every page of the newspaper. She's doing it too. They're taking it in. He always took everything in. So when peace became the subject, he knew what it was he wanted to express. He'd also been reading the underground press for a long time, and he knew about the counterculture's views on the state of the world.
Yeah.
And he'd written the song Revolution, and he knew about things. And now he wanted to say it.
Yeah. Why do you think it took him actually a few years to become a protest singer?
Well, protest singers, I mean, we think of Bob Dylan and maybe Pete Seeger and a few like that. John was never that kind of a musician or a composer. He communicated differently, though he did get to that point with some of his songs, like Working Class Hero. John Lennon's, something that never gets talked about is John Lennon's own personal journey. Because he had a very, like a lot of kids, he wasn't the only one, but he had a tough start in life. He felt abandoned and neglected by both of his parents.
He was abandoned and neglected by both of his parents.
Yes, he was, and he felt it. And he was raised in a positively strict manner by his aunt, which gave him a lot of good values about how to speak to people and standing up when a woman comes in the room and all that kind of thing, which they always did. All the Beatles would get up when someone came in a room. Nobody does that anymore. But that was the time that they were brought up. They were taught that kind of thing.
And the families.
Yes, exactly. But when his mother was killed when he was 17, having not so long ago made a stronger new connection with her, he became deeply embittered, and he was trouble. He was one of those young guys, teenager, that you see on the streets of a city who you want to cross the road to the other side to avoid because he looks like he's going to be trouble. In fact, he was very short-sighted, couldn't really see where he was going, didn't like wearing his glasses in public, didn't like being hit, so only didn't pick his fights unless he thought he could win. He was an abrasive, troubled young man who had quite a few episodes of hitting out. Paul speaks with great love for how John Lennon was kicked in a telephone box once in Liverpool. It's like, yeah, I'm with a guy who's kicked in a telephone box. But while he was with the guy who kicked in the telephone box, John was the guy who kicked in the telephone box. And that was who he was as a late teenager and early 20s. So his personal journey, the journey of a human being, forget that he's famous or anything, but the personal journey of any young man or young girl into a woman or into a man to learn about your own spiritual and personal growth and reach the point where you become a man of non-violence, where you've learned from your mistakes, if that's what they were, but you've learned from the things you've done in the past and don't want to repeat them. That carries a very strong message, and it also speaks volumes for just what a human being John Lennon was. Yeah. That in 1963 he was still involved in a very ugly incident in Liverpool at Paul McCartney's birthday party where he attacked someone and hurt them, someone who was close to the Beatles, a friend of theirs. And 6 years later he's sitting in bed talking about peace, and that is a very rapid journey to make. But it was a true journey, and many people in their lives never make that kind of transition, and he did it fast, but he was extraordinary. There's an interview during the Amsterdam week where he says, if someone punched me on the nose, I'd still punch them back on the nose, because sometimes you can't stop yourself. It happens instinctively. If someone hits you, you do hit back. But also because it's not contrary to the peace message, because he's not looking for the fight, but the peace he's referring to is an encompassing universal peace rather than a one-to-one. Yeah. You punch me on the nose, I might just punch you back.
And it is political.
It's political.
Yeah.
And there was a line I read in a book that I thought was very apt, and that is that the peace movement, which obviously had been very strong at different times through history, and especially after 1945, that most countries in the world had a peace movement, but they were channeling their campaigns down. They were preaching to the converted, if you like. Mm-hmm. They weren't reaching the masses with their peace message. If you went to a peace club meeting, you would hear messages of peace, but you already thought it, because that's why you were there. There wasn't a lot coming through in the mainstream media, and the mainstream media are typically tools of the establishment, and they're part and parcel of their commercial corporate ventures, and they do things a certain way, and they're part of the problem. Well, John Lennon took his message to the problem. He used the mainstream media in a way that hadn't really been used before to pass on a message that they didn't really want. Yeah. And used his fame to get it across. And it was unfortunate, although not unpredictable, that it was laughed at. But the sincerity behind it was 100%.
Yeah, you're very strict about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. A sincere journey and the sincerity of his message. Yeah. And still people laugh about it now, 50 years on, I'm afraid to say. They just think it was all just a mad prank, you know. Or an ego trip.
Or an ego trip. Or as Donald Zeck said, that something like these two astute peace lovers are laughing all the way, they're vibrating all the way to the bank. So having spent an hour with John Lennon and hearing his sincerity and hearing him explain himself, at the end of it he wrote that this was all for money. I mean, that's how evil the press can be. Yeah. Because they had the opportunity to pass on the message, to reach a lot of people with what John Lennon was saying, and all he was saying was give it a chance. He wasn't saying, you know, let's let's all sit down around the table now. And, he's actually saying, everybody, in your minds, just allow the possibility that we could be different, that we could coexist differently. That's it.
If everybody wanted peace like they wanted a new TV set, there would be peace.
Yeah. And there were a lot of troubles in 1969, just as there are now. There are a lot of strife in the world, a lot of death, a lot of confrontation. And the revolutionary movement was they were looking for overthrow, right? And he's saying, why don't we be at peace instead? Live harmoniously. It's quite a different message to the counterculture's usual message.
John Lennon used to say that Paul McCartney is the best PR man in the world, but he wasn't that bad himself too.
No, he wasn't. I mean, absolutely right. They were communicators, so when they had something to say, they could say it, and they knew they were direct communicators, and no one was ever more direct than John Lennon. He always looked everybody completely in the eye. He looked every camera in the lens. He looked every TV camera straight in the lens as well. Yeah. If you were with John Lennon, you would have complete eye contact. He was that sincere. Yeah.
And that's exactly what makes them two so interesting, because Paul McCartney is more like the gloss over everything.
Yes.
It tastes good, it looks good, it sounds great. And John Lennon is a directness in everything he does.
I'm hesitant to make comparisons like that, because Paul is just, he's Paul McCartney. I mean, we could speak up for 3 hours about Paul McCartney without any difficulty.
We can talk the rest of our lives about Paul McCartney.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm hesitant to say, because promote one by denying another.
No. I want to promote them both, but that's exactly what makes the two of them so interesting, because there was like a chemical reaction between those two characters that makes what the Beatles was.
Yeah. When they meet in 1957 and start hanging around in 57, 58, when they're 15, 16, 17 years old, Paul is very useful for John, because John went around upsetting people quite intentionally. He would just upset people. He would be blunt with people when it wasn't necessary, and then those people would react. And it was Liverpool, and you're never far from a fight, especially in those days. And it was trouble. John was causing trouble, and Paul would calm it down. So Paul was very useful for John, for getting him out of difficulties that he was creating. But also John was very useful for Paul, because he sharpened him up and introduced him into situations that he might not have gone to naturally. So they were brilliant for one another all the way through.
Yeah, they were both brilliant communicators, but in a totally different way.
Yes.
And that's what makes them so interesting together.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Of course, after the bed-ins in Montreal and here in Amsterdam and in Vienna, there was the iconic song, The Ballad of John and Yoko.
Yeah.
Well, we all know about recording sessions, but what was the meaning of the recording session of that song, also for the relationship of John and Paul?
Well, The Ballad of John and Yoko is about, March the 16th to April the 1st, right? It's a little history of those 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so, incidentally, at the beginning of the song, he says, standing at the dock of Southampton, trying to get to Holland or France. So he was thinking of coming here to get married. Even though he got married in Gibraltar, it was France or the Netherlands. Although, being that he was in Southampton, there are no boats to Netherlands. Okay. From there. They go from Harwich, don't they? But that's the song, trying to get to Holland or France. In the end, they get married in Gibraltar. And then they go back to Paris and continue the honeymoon that they started before they were married. They have about a week in Paris altogether. And then they come here for... It's more business than honeymoon, but it is also still their honeymoon. And then they go to Vienna, and they fly back to London, and that's where the song finishes. 2 weeks later, he went in to record it, and it was the Beatles. But Ringo was making a movie, and he was busy, and they knew that. So Paul drums on The Ballad of John and Yoko. And George wasn't there. I still don't know exactly why George wasn't there. I still intend to find out, and I probably will, but at the moment I haven't. How much he knew of this recording session, whether he just was busy. He may have been busy recording Billy Preston. It's a guess, but it's possible it was in the right time frame.
Is it also possible that he was intentionally left out of the session?
It's possible, but unlikely.
Okay.
Unlikely.
Okay.
Because they didn't do that kind of thing. They didn't do things behind one another's
Okay.
backs. And they were quite open. So, but anyway, the result was that the two of them, just the two of them, went in and recorded. They made the whole track. So it came out as the Beatles, but really it's the Nerk twins. That's the name that they coined for themselves, or was given to them when they were much younger, when they were going around as a duo, the Nerk twins.
Yeah.
They record the Ballad of John and Yoko.
Yeah. And do you consider it as an act of love of Paul McCartney that he was so dedicated to this song?
Paul loved John. There's no question about it. And it was a good song, and he could contribute in his usual brilliant way, which he did. I mean, not only instrumentally, but with harmony vocals. And maybe tightened up the structure of it, I don't know. But they were always able to leave their problems at the studio door.
Mm.
So whatever problems are going on in their office at Apple, where things are beginning to turn sour now by April '69 on a business front, that doesn't matter once they reach the recording studio. And Abbey Road is the ultimate proof of that, because it's such a brilliantly positive, upbeat, bright record, so full of innovation and ideas, and it's made at a time of genuine difficulty between them. But musicians can't create unless they tune into one another. And quite clearly they could.
And they were
right
always
to the end.
able to do that until the very end.
Yes, and beyond the end as well, even when they got back together in 1973, when John, George and Ringo recorded a track called I'm the Greatest. They instantly find their groove as musicians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did the world already see the Beatles as a band in breakup when John and Yoko slept here in the Hilton Hotel?
No, the Beatles breakup was not anticipated by anybody, and it came as
so they already
as
talked
a shock.
about it, as you said.
They've talked about it privately. But the public had no idea that the Beatles were breaking up until they broke up, which is why it became as quite a shock to people when they read it. And for some people, that was a landmark day in their life to suddenly get that on the news, but because they hadn't seen it coming.
No. So even the fact that John was so close to Yoko in those days wasn't seen as a signal of...
These things, when you view things from history, you see patterns that you aren't necessarily present in the moment, that you don't see because you're too close to it, you're standing in it, you can't see the perspective. And now we can look at the Beatles breakup and see signposts along the way, although, as we've been discussing, they're not all true. Because after Abbey Road, they were still talking of making another album.
Really?
Yeah. But the conditions were no longer right, and it wasn't going to happen.
No.
But it was discussed. There was a meeting about our next album after Abbey Road was finished, and that meeting exists on tape. So I know it's true. Yeah. They were great. The Beatles story is just absolutely full of photographs, documents, recordings, films, videos, absolutely everything. If you're a historian researching this subject, you have the richest of paper trails imaginable, and also audio and everything, just everything.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much of them we can have, because it was a 60s thing, and in the 60s it was more developed than the 50s. We would have far fewer photographs, and they would have no cassettes, and we would have no video, and their TV appearances wouldn't have been kept necessarily, and so on. But we have a lot of the Beatles because of the 60s
so also in that
technology.
Sense, the 60s is the start of the modern age.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, is there anything you still want to say about the bed-in?
Yeah, I do. I've got about 40 pages of notes.
Well, you can read them aloud.
How long have you got? All day. I think that there's two things I want to say in conclusion. One is that we mustn't ever lose sight of the fact that of what they were trying to say, as opposed to the method of delivery. Okay, the method of delivery was actually just extraordinary. It was unique to go. Whoever else did that went into a room in a hotel, opened the doors and said, everybody, you can all come in and ask me anything you like, and I will answer every single question you have. I won't say I'm not answering that one. I won't have a PR guy filtering the questions. Yeah. You could come in and you would have direct access, and that was an extraordinary thing to do then, and seems even more so now, where everybody's got all these barriers up and the PR guy comes in and there's all these heavies. Amsterdam had no bad vibes to it at all that week. No Hells Angels came and caused trouble. There were no fleets of PR people. There were no one came in and made any difficulty other than journalists asking rude questions, which John was accepting. But it was in the spirit of openness. It was probably unrivaled in the sense of modern day events. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Yeah. And the second thing I want to say is that give peace a chance is the ultimate message of both the bedding campaigns, because he doesn't have the answer of how it can be achieved, because nobody has that answer. There is no answer, otherwise it may have been found by now, although maybe not. All he was saying was, give it a chance. Open your mind to the possibility of it. Think about how you might be able to help contribute to the possibility of it. That's all he's really saying. Give it a chance. It's not that strong a request.
It wasn't demanding peace.
It wasn't, no.
Or anything.
It's not like peace now.
No.
It's give it a chance, which actually is quite brilliant. The Beatles PR guy, Derek Taylor, who wasn't in Amsterdam, but was in Montreal, has wrote in his memoir that, as far as he was concerned, when John first told him that he was the slogan was, give peace a chance, that he thought it wasn't very strong. It didn't sound, as a journalist to him, it didn't sound like it had enough punch or enough bite to really, what we would now call, gain traction, that American word traction. Yeah. But it didn't need to overreach itself, because he was merely saying to people, open your mind, which actually is quite powerful in itself. Yeah. So the second thing I want to say is that Give Peace a Chance, which was born here in Amsterdam and completed in Montreal, was recorded late in the evening on the 31st of May, 1969. So we're about 2 months away today from the anniversary of that recording. And I would like to suggest that on the 31st of May 2019, that somehow through social media and other ways that we can all connect now, that the whole world sings Give Peace a Chance on the 31st of May this year. Children in schools, refugees, people of every colour, all the persecuted people, all the homeless people, all the warmongers out there, of which there are many, all the right-wing lunatics who are coming up everywhere these days. Sing Give Peace a Chance together, united on that day. It may not change anything, but what's the harm in trying? And I think that's really what his message was about.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that's how I want to finish off.
Dames en heren, Mark Lewisohn.